Some kings are remembered for their glorious victories. Others are despised for their humiliating defeats. And then there's Ferdinand VIII of Spain, a man who needed neither. He only needed himself, and a deformity that history would etch in the blackest of ink. Historians call him the worst king in Spanish history. But the truth is, Ferdinand wasn't just bad. He was living proof that absolute power, when placed in the hands of someone twisted in both body and soul, can turn a throne into a stage for the most depraved performances imaginable. I know, it sounds like a made-up shock story, but it's not. This is a tale with documents, witnesses, even letters from the victims themselves, many of which were so disturbing that his own descendants had them burned. Picture this: Madrid, autumn of 1819. The wind cuts like knives. Inside the royal palace, oil lamps cast a sickly golden light onto the high ceilings. In a locked room, a 16-year-old bride, Maria Josepha Amalia, sits trembling on the wedding bed, clutching a rosary. She believes babies are delivered by storks. No one has told her otherwise. And then the door opens. What steps through is no fairy tale prince. It's a 35-year-old man, overweight, reeking of wine, with the predatory eyes of a man who has never heard the word no. And with him, a grotesque medical abnormality that even modern science still struggles to fully explain. Don't worry, we'll get to that part later. But before we dive in, understand this. This is not a love story. It's not even a Shakespearean tragedy. This is a criminal record. And the crimes? All committed under the royal coat of arms of Spain. For Ferdinand VIII, the crown was not a symbol of duty or honor. It was a license to indulge his lowest appetites. Under his reign, the royal palace became a brothel. And yes, the royal archives became a display case for trophies soaked in human blood. If you think modern royal scandals are shameful, just wait until I tell you about Ferdinand's collection. In school textbooks, the childhood of kings is often painted in gold leaf, silk garments, grand feasts, wise tutors. But for Ferdinand VII, the story was different. He was born into power, but also into a system already corrupted at the core. His father, Charles IV, was a king so weak historians politely call him a figurehead. His mother, Maria Louisa of Parma, was famous not for her intellect or virtue, but for her rumored affairs. Even the question of whether Ferdinand was truly Charles's son is one historians preferred to leave unanswered. Yes, when your royal family tree begins in a bedroom clouded with suspicion, you can guess what kind of fruit it's going to bear. Ferdinand's childhood unfolded in the cold stone corridors of the Madrid royal palace, a place where power and rot lived together like two parasites feeding on the same host. There he learned his first two lessons. Power is something you inherit, not something you earn. And if you are high enough in the hierarchy, every sin can be hidden. From an early age, Ferdinand was frail, sickly, and physically unusual. Later medical records suggest his condition, macrogenetisomia, may have begun developing during puberty. But before his body became a weapon of pain, his mind had already been sharpened into a tool of selfishness. He wasn't raised to rule. He was raised to survive in a palace full of daggers, both literal and figurative. The result was a personality both timid and cruel, desperate for recognition, yet savoring the fear of others. Young Ferdinand grew up watching his parents be manipulated by Manuel Godoy, the powerful prime minister and rumored lover of the queen. In his mind, power and sex were two sides of the same coin. If you wanted to win this game, you had to use one to control the other. By his teenage years, Ferdinand was already showing disturbing tendencies. Records from a royal tutor note that he enjoyed watching others suffer, even when the cause was a prank of his own making. Around the same time, he developed an obsession with dirty stories whispered behind closed doors, seeds of the sexual fixations that would haunt him his entire life. But the worst part wasn't that he was spoiled, it was that he was never taught the word no. In Ferdinand's mind, everything he wanted, whether a throne or another person's body, was his by default. You see, monsters don't appear out of nowhere. They are cultivated, day by day, in the perfect environment. Ferdinand VII was the flawless product of a rotten palace, born in suspicion, raised in decadence, and maturing into a man whose body was both a curse and an excuse. In 1802, 17-year-old Ferdinand was arranged to marry Maria Antonia of Naples, his cousin and a princess from a powerful Italian family. For the royal courts of Europe, this was a golden alliance, cementing diplomacy and pure royal bloodlines. But what no one at the wedding dared to imagine was that their wedding night would become a dark legend whispered in palaces across Europe. Maria Antonia, 18, was raised as a proper Italian princess. Gentle speech, graceful dance, and absolutely no questions about men that might be considered indelicate. In her mind, marriage meant ballroom dances, hunting trips, and, eventually, a child. No one, not even her own mother, explained the process of making that child. That night, when the guests were gone and the palace corridors echoed only with the footsteps of guards, Ferdinand entered the bedchamber. And this is where his infamous deformity, long a whispered secret among the royal physicians, met reality. According to a letter Maria Antonia later wrote to her mother, Ferdinand simply stared at her for a long time, then awkwardly approached, using his cold hands to explore her body like a child touching a strange toy. She wrote, "He only looked, then gave a small laugh. His fingers trembled, and then he sat down again, saying nothing." For the next 11 months, the marriage remained unconsummated. Ferdinand would become aroused, attempt to perform his duty, and then stop, not knowing what to do next. His deformity made the act a physical puzzle with no solution. Painful for his wife, humiliating for him. The situation became so dire that Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, wrote a desperate letter to Ferdinand. "My daughter weeps each night. The prince feels nothing. All attempts are useless. This situation is extraordinary and unfortunate for anyone at his side." When your mother-in-law has to intervene in your sex life, you know the royal marriage has gone from ceremonial to emergency. Finally, a desperate solution was arranged. A Catholic priest, Ferdinand's personal confessor, was sent to give him explicit instructions. Imagine the scene, the future king of Spain being tutored in intimate mechanics, not scripture. The result? After nearly a year, they managed to consummate the marriage. But instead of happiness, tragedy followed. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages, likely due to internal injuries from Ferdinand's abnormal anatomy. Less than 2 years after their wedding, she died at 21, leaving behind a final letter to her mother hinting at pain coming from the marriage itself. This was the turning point. From an embarrassed, incompetent prince, Ferdinand transformed into a man obsessed with sex. The death of his first wife didn't humble him, it freed him. From here, he would plunge headfirst into depravity, and the next queen's fate would be even worse. After Maria Antonia's death, the Spanish court faced an urgent problem. Ferdinand still had no heir, and the throne required one. The solution? Another marriage. The next victim of this political arrangement was Maria Isabel of Portugal,
his own niece. Yes, 19th-century European royalty had an unhealthy obsession with keeping the bloodline pure, a polite way of saying inbreeding. Concerns about genetic health? Never on the agenda. Maria Isabel, just 19, was described as modest, plain, and unremarkable. In the eyes of Madrid's aristocracy, she had three strikes against her: ugly, poor, and worst of all, Portuguese. Locals even mocked her with a cruel rhyme: feia, pobre y portuguesa. Ugly, poor, and Portuguese. But to Ferdinand, Maria Isabel was nothing more than a breeding vessel, a tool to produce a legitimate heir. Love? No. Respect? Also no. For the first years of their marriage, Maria Isabel endured in silence. While Ferdinand continued his nightly expeditions to Madrid's brothels, she stayed in the palace, focusing on cultural projects like founding the Prado Museum. The irony was that while the king collected blood-stained trophies, the queen collected art. In 1818, Maria Isabel became pregnant. That's when the nightmare truly began. When labor started, royal physicians discovered the baby was breech, an extremely dangerous situation at the time. Without modern anesthesia, without sterile surgical rooms, their tools were limited to knives, strong liquor, and opium. The doctors faced a choice: save the mother or save the child. Maria Isabel was young and could easily have more children, but Ferdinand only cared about one thing: the heir. He ordered, "Save the child. Cut her open if you must." The surgery began. Maria Isabel's abdomen was cut open while she was still conscious. The opium wasn't enough to fully sedate her. Midway through, her eyes shot open, and she let out a scream so loud the maids outside the chamber could hear it, but the doctors didn't stop. The baby, when pulled out, had been dead for hours. Maria Isabel bled rapidly. Within minutes, she slipped into unconsciousness and died. 21 years old. No final words. Ferdinand didn't mourn. There was no grand state funeral. Only weeks later, he was already searching for a new wife. Maria Isabel's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was proof that to Ferdinand, women existed only to serve the throne, and the throne existed only to serve his desires. And if you think the first two marriages had already hit rock bottom, wait until you hear about the third queen, Maria Josepha Amalia, the woman who turned the royal bedchamber into a prayer room for 10 long years. In 1819, just a year after Maria Isabel's death, the Spanish court arranged a fresh match for Ferdinand, this time Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. She was only 16, raised in a convent, and so pure-minded she genuinely believed babies were delivered by white storks. Yes, when the monarchy needed a baby-making machine, they picked a girl who had never even heard of sex in practical terms. A strategic blunder, or perhaps just fate's cruel joker. The wedding night took place in the royal palace of Madrid. Maria Josepha sat on the bed in her white gown, clutching her rosary. There were no instructions from her family. Her German ladies-in-waiting were too embarrassed to explain anything. The door opened. Ferdinand entered, 35 years old, heavy, smelling of wine. But what truly froze Maria Josepha in terror was what he brought with him. The same deformity that had injured his first wife and likely contributed to his second wife's death now appeared before a girl who had never even seen a man undressed. She screamed and bolted from the bed. Ferdinand, drunk and furious, chased her, but she was faster. Enraged, he stormed out into the hall completely naked, shouting at the ladies-in-waiting, "Prepare her for me within 15 minutes!" The ladies tried to explain, but only made her more terrified. When Ferdinand returned, ready to complete the act, he was met with an unforgettable scene: the wedding bed soiled, the result of sheer panic. Ferdinand recoiled in disgust, sneering,
This queen has none of the civet's fragrance," and left her untouched for a week. In the following months, Ferdinand tried again. Maria Josepha resisted fiercely, biting, scratching, even kicking him in the groin. Eventually, Ferdinand took another approach. He wrote to the Pope for help. Pope Pius VII must have sighed deeply when reading the letter, but as the Holy Father, he replied, explaining that marital relations were a duty before God and producing an heir was the Queen's sacred obligation. Maria Josepha agreed, on strict conditions. The entire rosary must be recited before each attempt. She would keep her eyes closed the whole time. She would think of the Virgin Mary to preserve spiritual purity. The result? For 10 years, every attempt at intimacy was accompanied by whispered, "Hail Mary, full of grace," as if they were in a church, not a bedchamber. No children were ever conceived. For Ferdinand, who bragged of his exploits in brothels, this was a humiliation. But he didn't give up. When Maria Josepha died of fever at 25 in 1829, Ferdinand was almost relieved. The throne needed yet another queen, and this time he would find one who could endure his deformity and produce the heir he so desperately craved. Enter Maria Christina, the woman who would bring the world the most infamous royal sex cushion in history.
This wasn't just depravity. This was systematic predation, blending political cruelty with sexual violence. And remember, the inventory we know about is incomplete. Maria Christina ordered the entire collection burned, but not before several witnesses recorded what they saw, their testimonies matching too perfectly to be dismissed as gossip. The truth is, we'll never know how many women suffered. For every blood-stained cloth that survived long enough to be recorded, how many victims were silenced? How many resisted and escaped? How many never had the chance? Ferdinand took those secrets to his grave, but his legacy wasn't the throne he passed on, nor the laws he rewrote. His true legacy lay in that chest, a hidden museum of human suffering, curated by a man who confused power with permission. She would think of the Virgin Mary to preserve spiritual purity. The result? For 10 years, every attempt at intimacy was accompanied by whispered, "Hail Mary, full of grace," as if they were in a church, not a bedchamber. No children were ever conceived. For Ferdinand, who bragged of his exploits in brothels, this was a humiliation. But he didn't give up. When Maria Josepha died of fever at 25 in 1829, Ferdinand was almost relieved. The throne needed yet another queen, and this time he would find one who could endure his deformity and produce the heir he so desperately craved. Enter Maria Christina, the woman who would bring the world the most infamous royal sex cushion in history. By 1829, Ferdinand VII was 45, diseased from years of brothel visits, and still without a legitimate heir. The deaths of his first 3 wives didn't deter him. In fact, they only seemed to sharpen his determination. The next candidate? Maria Christina of Bourbon-II Sicilies, his 23-year-old niece. Yes, niece, because if there's one royal tradition Ferdinand respected above all else, it was incest. But Maria Christina was different. She wasn't naive. She had studied the fate of her predecessors and came prepared. Beautiful, intelligent, and ruthlessly pragmatic, she understood that producing an heir was not just a political duty, it was an engineering problem. After reviewing Ferdinand's medical records, the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez, reached a simple yet brilliant conclusion. The problem wasn't only Ferdinand's grotesque size, it was the physics. If the tool was too large for the garden, either the tool had to be altered, impossible, or the garden had to be adapted. The solution? Una almohadilla, a specially crafted silk cushion with a precisely measured hole in the center. just 4 centimeters deep. When placed between the king and queen during intercourse, it acted as a barrier, allowing only the functionally necessary portion of Ferdinand's anatomy to make contact, preventing the internal damage that had killed his first 2 wives. Maria Cristina presented the idea with diplomatic finesse, framing it not as an admission of deformity, but as a medical necessity for the health of the crown. Ferdinand's massive ego swallowed the bait. Their first night using the device was awkward. Ferdinand, who once bragged about his size, now had to accept a limitation, but it worked. Within 3 months, Maria Cristina was pregnant. On October 10, 1830, the cannons of Madrid fired in celebration. A healthy baby girl, the future Queen Isabella II, had been born. 2 years later, Maria Cristina produced another daughter. It had taken 4 wives, 2 deaths, 1 papal intervention, and a custom-engineered sex cushion. But Ferdinand finally had his heirs. Yet this victory created a new problem. Spanish law forbade female succession. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, expected to inherit the throne. But Ferdinand, unwilling to let his painstakingly engineered heirs be denied, rewrote the rules, triggering a civil war that would drench Spain in blood for years to come. And still, behind the politics, the king's darkest obsession continued, his blood-stained collection of virgin trophies, the most grotesque archive in royal history.
If you think the royal sex cushion was the strangest artifact in Ferdinand VII's private life, you're wrong. The true crown jewel of his depravity was hidden in a cedar chest, wrapped in silk. When Ferdinand died in 1833, Queen Maria Cristina ordered a discreet inventory of his private chambers. What they found shocked even the most jaded courtiers. Inside the chest were dozens of neatly folded white cloth squares, each labeled in handwriting with a woman's name and a date. They were blood-stained sheets, trophies from virgins he had personally deflowered. Some names belonged to prostitutes from Madrid's seediest brothels, others to palace servants, widows, peasant girls from villages visited during royal tours. Each piece of cloth represented a conquest, sometimes willing, more often not. But the pattern was even darker. The dates on the cloths matched key political events. After every liberal uprising he crushed, after every political opponent he executed, multiple trophies would be added to the collection. Violence in the throne room was followed by violence in the bedroom. It was as if Ferdinand saw sex not as pleasure, but as another weapon of state terror, a way to humiliate his enemies by violating their daughters, sisters, or wives. One name stood out in the inventory: Anna, 15 years old, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, dated February 1823. Colonel Bermudez had been executed for participating in a failed constitutional revolt. Days later, his daughter came to the palace to plead for her father's life. She left with her father dead and her innocence destroyed, memorialized in Ferdinand's sick collection. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII, Spain's most depraved monarch, finally died. There was no wave of grief sweeping across the nation. His own brother, Don Carlos, didn't wait for the body to cool before declaring himself king, sparking the bloody First Carlist War. His widow, Maria Cristina, shocked the court by quickly marrying a common palace guard, just one last scandal to close the book on Ferdinand's reign. Politically, Ferdinand left Spain fractured. His insistence on rewriting succession laws to secure the throne for his daughter Isabella II plunged the country into years of civil war, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. But Ferdinand's real legacy wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the palace bedrooms and the burned cedar chest of silk-wrapped trophies. It was in the unnamed women who suffered in silence,
whose only crime was crossing paths with a king who saw them as possessions. Every historian who studies his reign comes to the same conclusion. Ferdinand VII was not simply a bad ruler, he was a predator with a crown. Stanley G. Payne called him cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful. The Duke of Wellington, who met him in person, put it more bluntly, the most contemptible of God's creatures. And yet, even those descriptions are too kind. This was a man who turned his physical deformity into a weapon, who collected human suffering like others collect art, and who left behind a dynasty poisoned by his own bloodline's corruption. His daughter, Isabella II, inherited more than the throne. She inherited her father's scandalous appetites. Her own reign would collapse in disgrace, driving the Bourbon dynasty from power. The very crown Ferdinand twisted history to protect was lost because of the same sickness he carried. In the end, Ferdinand VII is remembered not for noble deeds or great achievements, but for a grotesque silk cushion and a burned chest of blood-stained cloth. The monarchy he represented was no longer a sacred institution. It was a sordid joke. Perhaps the cruelest irony is this. Monsters don't always hide in forests or under beds. Sometimes they sit on thrones, and sometimes history remembers them exactly for what they were.
And that is the story of Ferdinand VII, a king deformed in both body and soul, leaving behind a legacy not of glory, but of blood, tears, and humiliation. But this is not the only story. History is filled with other crowned monsters, only no one has told them to you like this before. If you want to keep uncovering the truths that school textbooks leave out, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and share this video with anyone who still believes royal history is all about splendor and honor. Because here, we tell history exactly as it was, raw, ruthless, and sometimes so disturbing. You have to ask yourself, do you really want to know the next truth?